How are you? Yes, yes. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Fred Hoff. I'm the director of the Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. I want to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council for the public launch of Rebuilding Syria, Reconstruction and Legitimacy. This initiative is a 2-year project. It aims to identify what can be done now in terms of physical reconstruction, where special opportunities may exist. And it aims to develop a long-term plan that would address the massive reconstruction requirements of Syria in the future. This project, however, is not just about bricks and mortar. It's not simply about rebuilding urban areas, restoring basic infrastructure, or rehabilitating the petroleum sector. It will inevitably have to grapple with the question of how, if at all, investments, loans, and grants can proceed on a suitably massive scale if legitimate governance is absent. Can rules-based countries and international financial institutions inject into Syria the resources to rebuild if those resources in any way intersect with those principally responsible for the country's destruction, those whose record of incompetence, brutality, and corruption is well established. Alas, those who have been secured politically, at least for the time being, by Iran and Russia. Over the next 2 years, this project will convene key stakeholders and experts, not the least of whom are Syrians. Those of us who live and work in Washington, D.C., the world capital of all about me, often forget it is Syrians who reside at the hub of the challenge and the crisis we do our best to address. In our Syria Source blog here at the Council, we try our best to make it all, or at least mainly, about Syrians. This project will proceed in the same spirit. This initiative has been made possible by the generous support of Mr. Omar Shawaf, a Syrian-Saudi businessman and philanthropist. You have his bio. All I'd like to say is that Omar Shawaf has been hands-on when it comes to reconstruction and serving people in Syria. In 2013, he founded in Turkey the Bina Organization for Development, an NGO providing infrastructure and management support inside Syria for hospitals, semi-permanent housing for the displaced, and rehabilitated water systems. I'm very much looking forward to our program this afternoon. I would invite those so inclined to join the conversation and submit questions via Twitter. The address is @ACMidEast with hashtag Rebuilding Syria. That's @ACMidEast with hashtag Rebuilding Syria. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the person who has made this initiative possible. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Omar Shawaf.
Sorry. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the launch of the Atlantic Council's newest initiative, Rebuilding Syria, Reconstruction, and Legitimacy. This begins a 2-year conversation that will produce a strategic roadmap to reconstruction in Syria that is informed by Syrians, academics, policymakers, and practitioners. I'm honored to be here and be speaking on such a critically important and increasingly timely subject. I wanted to start by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Atlantic Council and the many people who are involved in this project. Fred Kemp, for his leadership and support of both this effort and the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Fred Hoff, for his relentless pursuit of a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Syria through any and all means available to him. He is a true champion of the people of Syria, and for this, we will always be grateful. Faisal Itani, who is spearheading this initiative with gusto, grounding it in reality with academic rigor. To our speakers today, who have so graciously given their time to share their wisdom and expertise, thank you. And to those here today, thank you for joining us. So, last week marked 6 years of the conflict in Syria. 465,000 people have lost their lives in this tragedy. Almost 2 million have been maimed and wounded. 13.5 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. Almost 5 million have fled as refugees, and at least 6.5 million have been internally displaced. But we must remember that these numbers represent human beings, actual people, families, children, whose lives have been ripped apart and turned upside down, who are struggling every day for sheer survival without basic necessities of food and shelter. We will never forget the photograph of Amran Dakhnish sitting dazed and bloodied in the back of an ambulance after surviving an airstrike on Aleppo, or 3-year-old Alan Kurdi's body, washed up on a beach as he and his family tried to escape the Syrian carnage to safety in Europe. We cannot forget the valiant efforts of the White Helmets, who risk their lives every day to dig out survivors after each air raid. We have been overwhelmed and numbed by images such as these of the destruction and devastation in Syria. And yet, these atrocities persist. We cannot, we must not forget what this effort is all about. It is about people. A great people that I feel honored to belong to. My people, my family, my kin. So, we find ourselves with an opportunity to freshly examine policies and attempt to shape the discourse here in Washington, as well as in Europe and the Middle East. This is a push not only for Syria, but for the greater Middle East, and our actions in the next months and years will dramatically affect that course. The United States must lead again in thought and action in the region. Yet the White House must not make the mistake of taking the Middle East and its myriad of players lightly, and should also not be singularly fixated on ISIS and its brutal extermination of all who oppose their warped and evil views. I urge you not to be swayed by the argument that this struggle is confined or defined as a struggle against a satanic cult called ISIS or Daesh. The future of the Middle East and its entire people are at stake. The world is interconnected like never before in human history, and we must therefore value each other as we value ourselves. The idea or notion of a fortress America, a disconnected Europe, an aggressive or expansionist Russia is or should be a thing of the past. A hands-off policy in Syria has led to Russia and Iran filling the void with disastrous effects. But Russia especially must rethink its approach in Syria. A policy of destruction will bear severe consequences. It's worth remembering that Russia was always considered by the Syrian people as a steadfast ally for good, not destruction and devastation. And they would do well to reconsider their path. And above all, the United States and the world cannot allow the Iranian expansionism to go unchallenged. The Iranian regime feels empowered as it has deliberately and methodically succeeded in Lebanon over the past 3 decades, and then in Iraq during the past decade. They now set their sights on Syria. Iran, by far, poses one of the biggest threats that the Middle East has faced in recent history. So this is not just about Syria, or Syria and Iraq, or even the Levant for that matter. It's many moving parts that will directly or indirectly affect us all. We should all be concerned about the national security implications for the US, Europe, and the Middle East if we do not engage in an appropriate and full fashion in the rebuilding of Syria. There is just too much at stake for us not to have a proper conversation about how the rest of the world should be involved. As Europe begins to defeat the wrong kind of populism, as the Prime Minister of Netherlands said last week, we must also respect and protect the independence of countries and their citizens. The Syrian people should not be used as a bargaining tool to advance the political interest or agenda of any particular party or country. Therefore, and to give the Syrian population an opportunity to live and thrive where they belong, in Syria, all parties involved must respect the people. The destruction and atrocities must end without preconditions. I believe that we owe a debt of gratitude to all the countries that have taken in Syrian and Iraqi refugees. And we would want to repay the kindness and humanity they have shown us by building an environment for all who wish to return to their native homeland. The overwhelming majority of Syrian refugees would choose to return home immediately. Not tomorrow, not next year, but immediately, if the basic environment was available. That is the purpose of this conversation during the next 2 years. This is a multinational conversation occurring amongst a number of government and non-governmental organizations. Some might question the timing of this conversation, given the ongoing violence, but the needs of the Syrian people are so great and the human costs are too high to wait for a solution. This is also a process that takes time. Starting it only when there is a solution is too late for those who will be returning home the day after. Many who will participate in this conversation will disagree on specifics, but we all, most certainly, agree that our family, our people come first, and we must, as a family, work together now. We need to focus on what will be necessary for Syrians when they are able to return home. This is not an academic exercise. This is an effort to provide the framework and expertise needed to rebuild the great and proud nation we once were. It is not the stones that make our Middle Eastern society great. It is, and will always be, our people. Thank you.
Okay. To get rid of this, read this out of the way. Thank you. Thanks. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining our launch of the project Rebuilding Syria. My name is Faisal Aitani. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, and I've worked mostly on the Levant, the Syrian conflict, and its local and international dimensions. We're doing so for about 4 years now. Let me say very briefly a few words about the details of the initiative and what we have in mind. This is the product of a conversation we had many months ago internally. We felt it was important to start thinking, A, about the urgency of what we can do in Syria now in terms of rebuilding, and B, whether or not we could start thinking usefully about a long-term plan and strategy for how to restore the country when things settle down militarily and politically. Now it's emerged as a much more sort of popular major issue in Washington discourse, but at the time when we started talking about it, I think it was a bit, it was seen as a bit unusual and eccentric. In any case, this is our attempt to think urgently and strategically about the problem. In terms of what we hope to produce in our output, we'll be doing, of course, a lot of short form and long form research, coupled by sustained outreach to the United States government, its allies, international organizations, NGOs, and of course, Syrians on the ground. But above all, the core of our thinking has been, first we held today our first actual workshop session between sort of a brain trust of area and functional experts that we put our heads together. We found that actually we did agree about a few major things over Syria and disagreed about others. But in any case, that's going to be key to our effort. Now, within the Atlantic Council itself, internally as a team, when we thought about this project, we did identify and ground a few basic principles we wanted to keep in mind. The first principle is that we wanted to look at this like a political economy problem, a problem that links social, political, and security illegitimacies and dysfunctions together with the question of, and sort of integrates the question of rebuilding and development in that formula. The second is that the United States and its allies have an interest in making sure this gets done well. They have a security interest, they have an interest in regional stability, and they have an interest tied up in the issue of population displacement and the refugee problem. When it comes to working on the local level, we are open to any opportunities we can seize right now in a sort of opportunistic manner to start laying the groundwork for a better life in these areas. Having said that, when we look at the national, countrywide level, we very clearly understood that we ran smack into the question of the politics of the conflict, whether that be the regime or the rebel groups or the extremist groups. And we are not going to do this in a sort of vacuum where we pretend that that doesn't exist and that we're in the day after and everything's fine and here's the plan. Other agencies can do that better than we can. This is our added value is that we can contextualize it in this sort of the ugliness of real life right now. So those are sort of our set bullet point views, and they're very broad. Everything else is really open from here on. And the most of the major questions have not been answered, but they've been posed. And I think now we at least have an idea what the most important ones are. So I'll stop talking and turn it over to our panelists. We have 4 panelists today. And not a lot of time, so I've asked them each to speak for up to 10 minutes. You have their biographies, but by way of very brief introduction, Dr. Osama Qadi is the president of the Syrian Economic Task Force. Todd Diamond is director for Middle East at Chemonics International. Mona Yakubian is, or Yakubian, former deputy assistant administrator for the Middle East at USAID. And finally, Mr. Bassam Barabandi is a former Syrian diplomat and the co-founder of People Demand Change, a development consultancy. So without further ado, Doctor.
Thank you very much. So you said 10 plus? Yeah. Thank you.
10 minus.
So as I'm economist, I agree with I made some deals in our room that I'll take 5 minutes of Bassam. So, and we paid everything done. I'm sorry, I have to read from what I wrote because we are, as economists, we have a lot of ideas and sometimes we get confused so easily. So we have to put those numbers in place. So bear with me while I'm reading, and then the question and answers will be open, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. And I'll promise to be as fast as I can. So ambassadors and their staff, State Department's representative, researchers, and people who cares about my country, Syria. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First, I need to thank Atlantic Council in general and Ambassador Fred Huff and his great staff, especially my friend Faisal Itani and Andre Taylor, who gives me the opportunity to join the core team of rebuilding Syria reconstruction and legitimacy project. So thank you. And to speak in this event along with this distinguished panel. It gives me a great pleasure to present the vision of Syrian economy in the future at Atlantic Council, and I'm really honored to envision the Syrian post-conflict rebuilding plan in a center that was named after a great man who helped Lebanon in its reconstruction after its civil war. In fact, the regime who helped in assassinating him will not be pleased that Syrians are following the patriotic, inspiring, blessed spirit of Rafiq Hariri, rebuilding what that regime has destructed. And I will try my best to summarize and condense the thousands of pages about Syrian economy within 10 minutes plus. Political freedom and economic freedom are twin, and Syrian governments and their economic teams purposely and sometimes hypocritically ignored this fact historically, which worsened the standard of living for Syrians, which made close to 50% of them under poverty line in 2011, and positioned Syria before the revolution as the worst failed 50 countries in the world, according to Failed State Index, and eventually brought the country to the level of destruction and absence of security. So any post-conflict plan should consider this fact. Success in post-conflict reconstruction depends on nearly simultaneously progress in the four pillars of post-conflict reconstruction. First, security. Second, justice and reconciliation. Third, social and economic well-being. Fourth, governance and participation. Progress in all four of these areas is highly linked. If progress in one area is to endure, it must be accompanied by the progress in the other areas. Immediately following any political solution, the country will, on the one hand, welcome the political transition, and with the end of the economic sanctions and the return of foreign aid and investment, along with the Syrian entrepreneurs who have been dislocated on account of security and or political concerns. On the other hand, Syria will need to face the immediate twin challenges of restoring its basic capacity in economic governance and reforming the institution and instruments that can restore and shore up its stability, including the payment of public sector wages, controlling inflation, and stabilization its currency and banking system. Some Syrians might be skeptical about the merit of this reconstruction project because while we are discussing the economic aspect of reconstruction, the Syrian regime, with the support of his allies, is still killing, torturing, committing war crimes against Syrians. Besides, Syrian regime continues his plan in evacuating people from their own land and sectarian demographical change in the Syrian map, recently Al-Wa'ar Homs as a case. The establishment of security in post-conflict environment is of critical importance to the success of reconstruction operation. So, economist is looking for legitimate political resolutions for this war against Syrians based on international Geneva laws such as Geneva I and the Resolution 2254 in order for any reconstruction ambitious plan to succeed. Needless to say that the security forces include non-criminal personnel, mainly first the border patrol, and restore all borders to the central government, the civil defense force, and the indigenous military. The security addresses all aspects of public safety, particularly the establishment of a safe and secure environment and the development of legitimate and stable security institutions that obviously should not be run by criminals who were involved in killing Syrians. A first step toward developing a comprehensive post-conflict resolution, reconstruction model would be the development of a model that can stimulate the initial establishment of security in a post-conflict reconstruction that preserves Syria united. Matter of fact, the real GDP growth for the post-conflict economy, according to some economists, is a function of 6 factors. First, the country's previous GDP, which is in Syrian case used to be 55 and right now less than 5. The amount of civil unrest in the country, and the civil unrest won't be resettled until genuine political solution according to UN resolution be in place. The degree to which the country is ethnically fractionalized, and the quality of country's institutions, and the quality of the country's economic policy, and the amount of international aid the country have received. International community main role would appear the most in the last factor. And Syrians are in a dire need not only for a genuine political solution, but also for Americans to lead the real Marshall Plan. I believe that the last thing the current American policymakers, contrary to the previous one, need Iranian era of influence to expand in the Middle East, because, to say the least, that will duplicate the Iraqi case divisive sectarian and ethnical political government, which establishes the mechanisms of economic destruction and leave the region seriously unsafe. Critical infrastructure are important, and mainly potable water, food, fuel, and electricity. They are essentially for preventing humanitarian crisis, social unrest within the population. Economically, the problem that Syrians will face is ISIS after reaching real political solution with the help of American policymakers, especially that ISIS is occupying main sources of water, large size of agricultural lands, and main source of oil. Immediate measures will need to be taken to underpin formal economy by stabilizing the currency and shoring up the banking sector and enforcing border control. I will jump. He start being angry. Okay, that's not good for stability. The state of the labor market in post-conflict economy should include unemployed persons, including discouraged workers, non-military, non-police government employees, private sector employees, and the country's per capita gross domestic product. Temporary reconstruction solutions would be by establishing safe zones in the north and in the south of Syria, and they will create safe haven for people, temporary, stop the air striking and bombing, and spur economic growth on small scale. And studies show that safe haven in the north includes more than 400 villages, and small cities will be able to protect at least 2 to 3 million people, and will generate approximately $100 million per month. And it has enough resources of water and electricity. Besides, the closer border points with Turkey, especially in the north, will allow the aid from the UN and international organizations to Syria inside, and will allow importing the needed products and exporting any industrial product to the world via Turkey. Such safe zones should be a very temporary solutions till reaching the ultimate political solutions. Now, there are many proposal policies and recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them right now. Maybe we'll, during the question and answers, for the post-conflict reconstruction after gaining back the Syrian sovereignty on its land and resources, and has the technocrats government that can be really implementing this. Finally, you'll be happy now. Hopefully, the current administration can recover the damages of the political vacuum that previous administration created, which prolonged the Syrian ordeal. As Marshall Plan saved Germany and spurred economic growth in Europe, Syrians are looking up to the United States to announce the economic Trump plan, Tillerson plan, if you would, to lead comprehensive reconstruction project for Syria in order to help make a united Syria far from any division and to become civilized economic emerging country with the help of the Gulf region and friends of the Syrian people. Contrary to what some believe, a plan for the reconstruction of a country destroyed by a tyrannical ruler is not a cake shared by nations, but a humanitarian and economic mission that returns to the world with economic development, safety, and stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Dr.
Thank you.
Todd? Yeah.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I think this is a vast undertaking that you have launched, and I am appreciative of being part of this. I'd like to make a couple of just suggestions, if I may, and raise a couple of questions on some of the more practical issues about development at a more micro level. The idea of reconstructing Syria in its current unified form is a major political and economic question. I think what's important from my perspective, what to discuss now, is sort of just what can be accomplished in the immediate space and what can be accomplished in the immediate near future that can have a lasting impact. I'd like to make a few comments about just development implementation principles in general, and also specific to post-conflict environments, although I think it might be a little bit aspirational to call this a post-conflict environment. And then this will be wrapped in some of the Syria-specific issues that we're dealing with right now. The modest goal that I would put forward is, I think the real immediate first step is to simply improve the livelihoods of people on the ground. I think this improved livelihood aspect is something that in a war-affected environment is something that is really tangential and will really create, it's an immediate necessity. And parallel with that, especially in a sectarian situation of violence that's going on right now, that we need to empower the local governance structures. There's a lot that's been talked about the local councils. We will hear more about them. I've got some comments about them. But I think demonstrating what's possible at the local level is really important to what can help build, I'll call it community cohesion. I don't know that I can address the issue of national cohesion at this point, given what's going on, but at least at the level of community cohesion. So how are we going to propose to do that? Or how is this happening, I should say, because there are activities going on right now. One is basic service delivery of essential services at the community level. Sort of the next step in that is institutional capacity building, sort of really building the capacity of the local governments and the local service delivery providers. And then ultimately also engaging in constituent outreach, because as part of the local governance structure, being responsive to the community, I think is key, as I mentioned, to building community cohesion. So in terms of like providing essential services, I mean, they're pretty well known, that the essential services that are needed right off the bat. They generally focus on health, education, social, like water supplies, utilities, just basic survival skills that are needed in the community. There are a lot of responders that provide assistance to NGOs that provide this to the community directly. What I propose is that, or what I think is key to making this move forward, is that the local actors are empowered to do this. The local councils need to do this. We need to help create the legitimacy of the local service providers by them being the ones that are responsible for providing the services to the community. And this is particularly important in Syria, where you have a competition for the allegiance to local actors, where you have armed actors that are actually not just trying to fight, but they're also trying to get credit for drilling the wells and providing the medical services, and even in some cases providing education. So there's this real tension of allegiance, and I think it's important that we invest in these local councils that are the legitimate entities in their communities to not just make sure that the livelihoods improve, but that the responsive governance is a part of that process as well. So how do we do that? Well, I think we invest basically in two key elements. One are the civil servants and the technical service providers who exist. They are there in Syria right now. There are hospitals to the degree that they're still running. Medical services is being provided. Education is a huge problem that we've heard a lot about, but there also are teachers that are still educating students. And we're not going to be the ones, the outside community, are not going to be the ones providing this education, but we're going to support the structure that exists there at the local level to keep that education going. And I might say that is irrespective of the curriculum. We don't need to get involved in the curriculum that's being taught, but simply create the infrastructure so that teachers can get paid, so that students can come to school, so that the process can be administered. I think this local administration is key to maintaining the credibility of these services. So in the process of providing these services, we also need to look, I think, farther down the road a little bit to the idea of institutional capacity building. We don't want, there's been a lot of reference to the term stabilization. How are you going to create stabilization in an environment like this? Stabilization to some means, blankets and water, and others it means some of the basic services that I'm talking about, providing education, providing hospitals, providing running water. That is all true, but again, to reiterate the point, I think what's key to the institutional strengthening of these communities is having them being empowered to do it themselves. Them, the local councils, the local service, the directorates, the education directorates, the health directorates. These are government entities that exist in, the places that are more easily accessible right now in Idlib and the Aleppo countryside. These need to be reinforced. These need to be supported. And I think the key to sort of the long-term objective of service delivery is really that these entities are able to provide services once the relief assistance is gone. They can be inundated with funds to make things happen on a pretty short basis, but how are the systems put in place so that when the relief assistance is gone, that there can be fees for service, there can be taxes that can be raised, there can be self-sustaining enterprises that are what we take for granted here as public service utilities that are implemented sort of behind the scenes, but I think that infrastructure is something that's really important that needs to be revitalized in Syria. And then another aspect to this too that involves the local councils is the idea of them being accountable to the population. A lot of money is coming in from the outside, and local councils are getting support from outside actors. All eyes are on these local councils in terms of what they do with these funds. The idea of that these funds can just be brought in and doled out, I think, is a very dangerous concept. The local councils, the service providers themselves need to be held accountable and need to be transparent in terms of how the services are provided. When the money comes in, what is it being used to? How are resources being allocated based on the funding that exists? And these are concepts that need to be, if not taught, reinforced, how important it is that the funding be allocated in a transparent way and in an accountable way. For the most part, I believe there are, as I mentioned, the technocrats at the directorate level who are providing services right now in Syria. The communities get by, given the circumstances that they're under. But the higher level of administration and financial managers who actually sort of manage this process is a skill that probably needs to be enhanced so that the whole enterprise, if you will, the public service delivery enterprise is managed in a responsible way. And I think these are the capacities that can be provided right now, training that can be provided in a way that people will institutionalize this and internalize it and operationalize it going forward. The idea of constituent outreach that I mentioned, there are local councils in Syria that are elected, and they have continuous elections, and when elections take place and somebody loses power, there's a transition of power. It's actually a very representative system relative to what the circumstances could be like. And I think key to sort of maintaining that local capacity governance is being responsive to the community, being responsive to citizens' complaints. Now, I don't mean to be Pollyannish about this. I understand, given the circumstances that are going on in many of these communities, the idea of asking for a pothole to be filled in and then having it filled the next day is simply not realistic. But I think back to the idea of accountability and transparency, that the community understands what the local council is allocating its resources for and incorporating the priorities of the community. The needs are tremendous, and there has to be a prioritization of needs. So the ability to actually include community participation in making those decisions is very important. Essentially, the community is going to want to know the answer to basically two questions. Do municipal officials and staff have the capacity to do the jobs that they're supposed to do? And if they do, how well are they doing them? I think answering those two questions are things that the international development community can assist on a case-by-case basis. I realize that a lot of these interventions at this local level are very personality-driven, and you have to find a local council that's amenable to working in this with these addressing these issues in a way that we're amenable to working with them. And it's a fluid environment, and if we pick the right entry points, the idea would be that eventually they can be scaled up to neighboring communities and other communities. Finally, I'm just going to raise a couple of issues that are sort of important to international development principle, like the concept of do no harm. I'm sure we've all heard a lot about, but I'd just like to put it in the context, just sort of raise three questions or three issues that need to be concerned in this context. One is the displaced populations. Obviously, a goal is to have populations return. Well, in some cases, they're returning to barren places. In other places, they've been repopulated. In terms of managing those environments where populations are coming back and they're repopulated areas, the tensions that could arise out of that are quite challenging. Another question, my sole deference to economic issues, and I'll defer otherwise to the economist, is the idea of inflating the local economy. International development community faces a large challenge of inflating a local economy when it comes in, and especially in a post-conflict environment. Local wages, you mentioned paying local wages of staff. The international community, can come in and do that as well, and to distort the economy, A, to distort the economy when it arrives, and B, to distort the economy when it leaves. So I think those are some issues that need to be kept in mind as well. And lastly, I want to mention the issue of getting back to the local councils again, and the local power that comes with being a council member. I think it's important for us to be careful that when funding goes to these local projects, if the local councils are seen as being the controllers or the gatekeepers of how this funding gets allocated, there is the potential, and I'm not saying that this is existing at the moment, but I just want to raise the issue that there is the potential of distorting the value of holding on to office. And if you're elected locally and you have a history in that community of turning over power should elections allow that to happen, if purse strings come along with that, there could be a resistance to actually ceding power so quickly. Again, I'm not speaking of anything that's happening at the moment, but I raise that issue as a concern that needs to be, I think, thought out as we move forward. I said that was lastly. One more, just a couple other things quickly on security. We need to make sure that we're aware of issues that when U.S. or other international funds go into this environment, that they are managed carefully, because there is an allocation, there is responsibility that we have as donors to make sure those funds are used responsibly. And there's also the safety and security issues as well that you mentioned previously. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Todd. And I should mention that both the local angles of development, that itself is actually central to a lot of the work we're going to do, not all of it. At the same time, we put that in the context of the current trajectory of both the war and diplomatic developments and the effect that they may have in non-government areas at the level of institutions, civilians, or military for that matter. Mona?
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Faisal. And thank you to the Atlantic Council, the Hariri Center for inviting me here today and including me in this very important initiative. And I want to begin by commending Faisal for the work, not only that he's done so far, but that no doubt he will be doing over the next 2 years.
Thank you.
It's extraordinarily important. What I'd like to do, I want to respect the time limit as much as I can. I really want to distill what I have to say into 3 points. The first is that while it is important and commendable to be thinking now about reconstruction and rebuilding in Syria, and that it's critical to have, as I think you've put it, Faisal, a strategic roadmap, we also have to be thinking about the urgency of the needs inside Syria today. And in my lexicon, and again, we this morning had some debate about terminology, I would term everything that Todd described as stabilization. It's not immediate humanitarian relief. It's not long-term, large-scale reconstruction projects. It's stabilization. It's ensuring that communities where conflict has begun to recede have the essential services, have access to essential services, that capacity building is beginning amongst local governance structures, et cetera. This, to my mind, should be the priority. In many ways, it's in deference to Mr. Shawaf's very moving point about continuing to think about and place the Syrian people first and foremost in our sights. What's important about the work that Faisal is leading is that in thinking today, as we are implementing stabilization programming, about what the longer term needs will be and what a strategic plan for reconstruction will look like in Syria, we can begin to ensure that we are already beginning to integrate some of those elements into the more immediate short to medium term work that we are doing on the ground today in Syria. So for an example, we talked about this a little this morning. I can say in the case of Syria, there has been instances where there is a response, a knee-jerk response to immediately flow in, for example, food assistance into areas that have been recently liberated. What that does, though, unfortunately, is often distorts local markets in ways that are actually detrimental, not only in the long term, but even in the short term. So my first point is really about underscoring the importance of stabilization, and we can get into the back and forth about the terminology, but again, in my mind, it is work that is being done beyond humanitarian relief to begin to help communities get back up on their feet. That work, to my mind, should be the priority, but it should be part of an iterative process with the work that's being done here and elsewhere to think about what long-term reconstruction, rebuilding of Syria looks like, and how best to ensure that the work we are doing today is in service of that longer-term objective. So that's the first point. The second point is I think it's impossible to overestimate the difficulties and the obstacles that we face in Syria today, both on a tactical level and at a strategic level. Tactically, to do the work that we are talking about, you really need three primary conditions. You need security, you need access, and you need partners that you can work with. In each of those cases, we face enormous difficulties. Security, I don't think I even really need to go into it. It's quite obvious, although in the realm of security, I would underscore not only the rapidly shifting battle lines, the continual threat of regime bombardment, but also even when in a particular community the fighting has stopped, we have the pervasive and very expensive issue of dealing with unexploded remnants of war. And so clearing mines and other kinds of munitions, which is essential for doing any of the other work we're talking about, is an issue. Access. Access is in part contingent on security, but access, unfortunately, in Syria is also often held hostage to the competing agendas of the many players and actors in this increasingly complex battle space. And so we see, for example, Turkey, because of its issues, and not to make a judgment one way or another, but Turkey, therefore, can constrain access of non-humanitarian assistance into parts of northern Syria based on its disapproval of particular actors and their agendas on the ground. So access is not simply a physical issue, it's also often hostage to the politics of this very complicated conflict. And then partners. Who do we work with? I think it's important to underscore Todd's point about having these local councils and other actors on the ground who are civilian. We certainly don't want to entrench warlordism in Syria for lots of reasons, but certainly, again, thinking about the longer-term objectives. They should be representative, inclusive. They should have credibility on the ground. In the case of the United States, there's extensive vetting that goes on to ensure that there aren't connections to designated terrorist organizations. So finding and getting all three of those things in this environment is extraordinarily difficult. The strategic challenge far eclipses even the tactical ones that I've just laid out. In part, it is what we've all already described, and I think Fred raised very well in his opening remarks, the idea of pursuing stabilization and reconstruction in an environment in which there is no political settlement. How do we do that? In my mind, I think we see it in many ways apparent in the inherent contradictions of our Syria policy to date about the tensions between countering Assad and countering ISIL. Those tensions have real bearing on how we can operate on the ground. I think we're seeing it most dramatically right now in Manbij, where you literally have differing actors coming up against each other, where these agendas are almost literally clashing, and U.S. forces on the ground are forced to put themselves between those two clashing agendas, clearly detracting from any attempt or any ability to stabilize. More broadly, in my mind, as I've been thinking about this, I think we can think of it as, in a sense, a tale of two cities. It is the question of how and by whom Aleppo is eventually stabilized versus how and by whom Raqqa is eventually stabilized. Inherent in those questions really, I think, underlies the crux of the tension that we're seeing today, in the absence of a political settlement. So in the case of Aleppo, for example, will the West look to Russia and say, look, the Pottery Barn rules apply here, just as they applied to the United States in Iraq. You break it, you own it. In the name of sort of pursuing broader geopolitical agendas? Or will the international community heed Russia's call for a Marshall Plan? Likewise in Raqqa. Who's going to hold Raqqa? I mean, I think it's largely believed that Kurdish forces with U.S. training and assisting on the ground may well be the force that sees Raqqa, but Raqqa is not a Kurdish city. Who's going to hold Raqqa? Who's going to be responsible for stabilizing it? Again, what is the role of the Syrian government? What is the role of the international community? To my mind, those two cities and how they are or are not stabilized really speaks to this deeper tension that we all need to think through, I think, quite frankly, very creatively in terms of how to address. Let me conclude with my final point, which is really, in a way, an echo of the first point. Despite these challenges, it is essential that this work continue. And if people are interested, we can talk. I can't speak to the current administration, but I can certainly speak to what the previous administration did with regard to stabilization inside Syria. I would say going forward, the emphasis needs to be on two things. One is resilience, which Todd also talked about. Resilience meaning helping to ensure that Syrians that are in areas in which conflict has receded and they would like to stay, have the ability to stay there through livelihoods, through agricultural. So there's some very interesting work that USAID is pioneering right now in Syria, where the traditional development side of the house is working hand in hand with the relief side of the house, and are implementing programming that is looking to revitalize agricultural markets, address food security issues, and deal with livelihoods issues. There's a question that came to my mind through our discussion earlier this morning. Are there ways we can think about livelihoods in the service, ultimately, of what reconstruction inside Syria looks like? Are there small-scale industries and works that can already begin to be done that will help to serve the eventual rebuilding of the country? And finally, education. which is a critical need in Syria. UNICEF's report last week made for very sobering reading about the next generation of Syria, the future of Syria, a Syria in which right now 1.75 million Syrian students are not in school, in which 1 out of every 3 schools inside Syria is not serviceable. It is essential that we are beginning, AID is already beginning to look more and more at renovating and rehabbing schools, but also thinking creatively about non-formal education, about how to ensure that Syria's next generation, the generation that really is going to hold the future for Syria, is able to be educated once again. And I will stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Lots to think about. Bassam?
ما بعرف شو بدي احكي. Thank you,
احكي
Faisal.
اللي
Thank
بقلبك.
you. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Atlantic Castle, to having me. I think my colleagues, they cover a lot of points, and I will talk about completely different aspect of this conflict. I will be very much realistic, and I will be very much, you'll not like what I will say. Today, the administration, they will make a cut in the budget. This is very good for Syria, because in the last 6 years, the US government has spent billions of dollars on Syria without any accountability to the agencies that's spending the money. Today, the UN operation in Syria, they spent $1.5 billion in the regime area. And the UN as a system, just as a model, the system of UN, it has 4 or 5 agencies, ESCWA, WFO, the Mistura office, UN headquarters, and so on and so forth. And they get the money, and they are working completely on different agenda when it comes back to Syria. Today, when we are talking about all these tragedies that my colleagues discussed, and we are looking about the end game and trying to talk about in between, how to reach to the end game. I don't see there are so many local councils as my friends were talking about. All the local councils, liberated area, were valid in 2013, 14, 15, maybe even to 16. Today, if we look literally where are the local councils, they are very much limited, which is limited of the educational projects, of rehabilitation, or supporting the locals, because either we are talking about Idlib, which is Nusra Dahrar, or we are talking about Raqqa Deir Zor, or we are talking about the best model so far is the south. And the other areas are under the regime Iranian. The budget on Syria that we cannot stop it. I hope they will make more accountable for the project that already has been done, the organization that has been used. They ask them how United States benefit financially area. At the same time, they want to fight Iran. It doesn't work like this. Every single penny goes to the regime area. Whatever the reason or umbrella they are using it, they are empowering Iran and Russia inside Syria. And then we come back to the circle to say, how can we stop Iran and Russia from invading Syria? I understand the UN or the US, they don't want to engage too much in Syria politically, but still they have a lot of tools in order to tell the Russian and Iranian that this is not acceptable game anymore. And it is the money. It's not acceptable for the World Bank to take Syria to different limits, and they say Syria will be a failing state, and we have to start the money on the infrastructure in Syria in order not to have failing state. Again, we are empowering Russia and Iran in Syria, and we are far away from ending game to solve that problem. We have many models in Syria. Today is completely different from the models we had before. Syria, I don't see Syria now. We have central government. I don't think Damascus will be the center of Syria anymore. Maybe political center, and that's it. It's not anymore economic center. The Ba'ath regime from the 60s till Hafez Assad, till Bashar al-Assad, they make sure that the Syrian may not get together, and they only get together because of security. They really scared from the regime system, and that's what makes Syrian Syrian, rather than they have literally something too much together as society. After 6 years of this blood, sectarian, from everyone against everyone, I don't see the Syrian are getting together easily. So when we talk about reconstruction, it's not about building the buildings, rather than it's about building again who we are, how we can go forward as a Syrian, what they do, what the values that we are going to it. Failing to do this, I think we will go to another circle of violence. When we talk about reconstruction Syria, we should talk about reconstruction Mosul or Jordan. Syria is not anymore Syria. When Daesh, it comes from Mosul to Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa. So to thought about Raqqa as such, who will hold Raqqa and stop there, still Daesh is 100 kilometers away from us. So any project that will vision Syria to be reconstructed, they should think about Iraq. And when we talk about Syria in the south, we should think about Jordan. We talk about Qalamun, we should think about Lebanon. So I don't see Syria as Syria now. We cannot say or limit our vision that how we construct Syria rather than how to get all this area together from economic perspective. I'm not saying that I hope Syria will come back with Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, كل سوريا الكبرى. I love that. Yes, I know in reality that today we talk about economic perspective that we cannot handle Syria as the old Syria. There's no way to do it. When we talk about the economic teams and the people who did the reforms and they built the reforms, we cannot understand in the between 2006, 7, 8, 9, Syria, we had around 800,000 IDPs inside Syria. This before the revolution, 800,000, and they used to get food baskets from the UN, and the government never mentioned about them. And this big number wasn't because of the lack of resources, it's because of corruption, no vision, mismanagement, all you can name it. People talk about the drought in Syria in 2006, 7, but the drought at that time, it wasn't only on Syria. It was Syria, Israel, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. And only in Syria, we have 800,000 IDPs. I mentioned these IDPs because I know from Jazeera area, they say, why we are Syrian, why the regime in Damascus take our oil and we are poor. Why Aleppo people, they make their own manufacturing from our own products. And nowadays, we have the same model in Daraa. Now Daraa, they are circulating their own autonomy. And it's a document of 25 pages, clearly like the Kurds. To say why to go to Damascus, what's our connection with Damascus? When the regime attack us, they keep silent. When we are in suffering, they are enjoying. Economically, before the war, after the war, we are suffering. So Syria is completely different. And when we think about Syria, we have to think completely about the new Syria that we are living now, not the Syria that we hope. Any thinking of reconstruction should not ever reward Iran or reward Russia or reward the regime. I see many statements from de Mistura or from UN, from World Bank, from others organizations to say that all stakeholders should agree on the political settlement and on the reconstruction. It doesn't work like this. After all this suffering, the people who make these crimes, they should pay for it. It's not about just reconciliation, just normal reconciliation, Syrian reconciliation or international reconciliation on Syria. We need a lot of Syrian business people who have national ID, national agenda to show up and take the lead. I think this one of the route that we didn't use it yet. The opposition, political opposition, I don't say they failed, but they didn't deliver. Military opposition, they failed big time for whatever reasons. We need to keep the hope going on, and I believe that reconstruction could be the hope, and the reconstruction should be led by Syrian business people who have a lot of money, credibility, clean agenda, clean money, and they can give us the hope to go forward. It's very difficult for us to find Hariri. I'm talking about the model like Hariri. We don't have Syrian Hariri, unfortunately, right now, but we have the Hariri model. Hariri, Habib al-Hariri, Allah yarhamu. And even Hariri, Allah yarhamu again, when he made the model, it wasn't a good model. When he focused on Beirut and he forgot Antoniya, Lubqa, Junub, Baalbek. So now Lebanon is the same circle of unbalanced economically because of that. So in Syria, again, because of what we suffer in Syria, we need maybe 10 Hariris or 15 Hariris to get together and try to give hope for one more step forward. I believe in the United States. This is our hope. This administration policy towards Syria, regardless how the American audience see it, I think for me as a Syrian, I think it is good. As long as their enemy is Daesh and Iran, it is good for Syria, no matter how they will play it out. We as a Syrian, I think we should invest in this administration. I know there will be a major cut in the money. That's good. And they should start with the regime area. And let the Iranian and the Russian feed the Syrian under occupation. Why U.S. pay the money for these people and these people are occupied them? I will go one further step, ugly step. They should stop funding the area under Nusra, under Ahrar. It's not acceptable. It's not a humanitarian talks that I'm saying. I know people will suffer. But again, when the United States want to fight Nusra, they shouldn't give the money to the area under Nusra. They should find the ways to cut that money or fund that money or help these people without going to Nusra. I know from Muna and I know from Tim, there's a lot of vetting, a lot of this problem that she mentioned. I work on that issue. I know exactly what I'm talking about. But again, the fight against extremism is not only Syrian fight. It's US fight, international fight. You cannot give them money to the people under Nusra and ask us to fight them. It doesn't work like this. So I hope, again, by cutting the budget, they will reconsider it, reevaluate it, all the projects, Syrian Trust Fund, USID, Cominex, all the projects, in order to have political message. In the last 6 years, when we sit with the Republican at the House or Senate, they say we are spending money, but there's no political value. Why we are spending all this money on Syria? We are not a charity. We are just spending money, but what we are asking for. And there's no answer, not from us, not from the administration. This administration, at least they are clear. We are anti-Iran, anti-Daesh, and anti-Nusra. That's great. So I think they will allocate the money, or they use the money that already allocated after the cutting the budget, whatever it is, to fight them under the regime area and under Nusra and Daesh, or what we call liberated area. And thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think one thing all the panelists have demonstrated is that the question of rebuilding is only partly a technical one. And there's about, I think, 4 more dimensions at least that we defined here. And I think as we unpack the problem, we'll find even more. Unfortunately, actually, we are out of time and we have to give up the room. You'll be happy to know that after 5 hours of holding you hostage here at the council, you're free to go. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. Thank you.